Hey everyone, welcome back. The topic we're diving into today is something that's a little unsettling but super interesting: manipulation. And more specifically, how it is that language, the thing we use every single day to talk to each other, can actually be used to control us without us even realizing it.
It's funny, when you think about manipulation, we often jump to these really obvious examples, like a
Yeah.
used car salesman who's being super pushy or someone telling a really blatant lie. But the reality is manipulation is usually a lot more subtle than that. It operates in these kind of gray areas of language, which is what makes it so sneaky and effective.
Right, it's like this hidden force that's at work.
Yeah.
And to really dissect how this works, we're turning to the work of a researcher named Tien Van Dyke, and specifically his article called Discourse and Manipulation: Theoretical Discussion and Some Applications.
Catchy title.
I know, right? But before you tune out thinking, oh, great, another boring academic paper, let me tell you, this one gets into the nitty-gritty of how powerful people, from politicians to, yeah, the media, can use language to pretty much control how we think and what we do. And the really scary part, most of the time, we have no clue it's even happening.
It's true. Manipulation is really all about power and control at its core. It's about knowing how to use language to kind of nudge people, maybe even subconsciously, towards certain beliefs, or to get them to do things that the manipulator wants, even if those things might not actually be in their own best interest.
Okay, so it's almost like mental sleight of hand. But then where does it differ from persuasion? I mean, think about it. We see persuasive language all the time. Advertisements, political campaigns, I mean, even just trying to get a friend to try that new restaurant you like. What actually separates those situations from manipulation?
That's the key distinction, right? Persuasion is about laying out the facts, presenting different arguments, and letting the other person make an informed decision based on what you've presented. Kind of like an open debate. You weigh the evidence and you choose which side you think is stronger. But manipulation's different. It's about rigging the game from the start. It's about twisting information, playing on people's emotions, and using these subtle linguistic tricks to basically box them into making the decision that the manipulator wants them to make. And often, the person being manipulated has absolutely no idea they're being led down that path.
So, less about logic and evidence and more about controlling the whole narrative. Okay, can you give us an example of what this might look like in the real world?
Absolutely. So Van Dyke talks about how governments can use manipulation to shape public opinion on something like immigration. It's an issue that often brings up strong emotions. So they might repeatedly link immigration with crime, even if the data doesn't really show a strong connection. The point is to make people feel afraid, anxious. And as those feelings grow, people become much more likely to accept stricter immigration policies. Policies that, of course, the government wants to put in place, even if they don't actually benefit the people in the long run.
Wow. Okay, that's kind of chilling. It's almost like we're talking about mind control here. How can something as simple as language really have such a powerful effect on what we think and what we do?
Well, that's where Van Dyke's work gets really fascinating, because he actually breaks this whole process of manipulation down into three different levels, with each level kind of building on the one before it. And the first level, he calls it short-term memory manipulation. It's about how our brains process information in the moment.
Short-term memory. So like how we're drawn to a catchy slogan or those clickbaity headlines that are everywhere online, like our brains are almost wired to latch on to that stuff.
Exactly. It's not even necessarily the message itself, but how that message is delivered. Like, think about bold headlines. They're designed to grab your attention, those little sound bites that are taken totally out of context just to stir outrage. Or even just the way that certain information is presented, emphasizing some points while totally downplaying others. And, on their own, these tactics aren't necessarily always manipulative, but they're tools, and they can definitely be used that way.
It's like a magic trick almost. You think you're in control, paying attention to what's important, but really there's this whole other thing happening behind the scenes, guiding you towards what the magician wants you to see. And this leads us to that second level, right? Where manipulation digs a little deeper.
Right. This is where things get even sneakier, because now it's not just about what you pay attention to in the moment. It's about how you store and recall information. Van Dyke calls this episodic manipulation. It's about influencing how we make sense of things that have happened.
Wait, you're saying our memories aren't neutral? That even the way we remember something can be influenced by manipulation? Okay, now you're messing with me a little bit.
Well, think about it. Have you ever noticed how a news story might leave out certain details or present a particular angle on an event, and that shapes how you interpret what happened? Or how about the politician who shares a very carefully crafted anecdote to create this specific picture that supports their narrative?
Wow. This makes me think about all the times I've formed an opinion about something based on, like, a news article or even just a social media post. What if I was only getting a very carefully curated version of the story? What if I was missing crucial context? That's what makes this so tricky, right? It's like it's like they're giving us the highlights, right? Instead of the whole game. They get to choose which plays we see, and they make sure it's only the ones that make their team look good. No wonder it works so well. We think we're making up our minds based on the evidence, but that evidence has already been like filtered and arranged to get us to think a certain way.
Exactly. And because it's affecting how we're remembering and interpreting these events, it can have this really long-lasting effect on our beliefs about things. And this leads us to the third, and I think the deepest level of manipulation, what Van Dyke calls social cognition.
Social cognition. Okay, now we're getting into some really big picture stuff, aren't we? Not just about like specific memories or opinions anymore, but our whole entire worldview.
Right. This level of manipulation, it's about shaping your most deeply held beliefs, your knowledge, attitudes, even your ideology. It's about how you understand the world works and your place in it.
So less about manipulating a single news story and more about this constant subtle drip feed of information that can, like, I don't know, shift our whole perspective over time, like
Yeah.
slowly turning the dial on the thermostat so we don't even notice the change until we're either freezing or sweating.
That's a perfect analogy, and sometimes those shifts are really hard to undo. Van Dyke actually uses the example of how the U.S. responded to 9/11. All the messaging around safety and security, and yeah, it makes sense in that context, but it also created this environment where people became more willing to accept policies that before they might have thought were unthinkable, even if it meant giving up certain freedoms.
Wow, that's powerful. And kind of scary when you think about it. It makes me wonder if this kind of manipulation is happening on such a big scale, shaping how we respond to these huge events. What hope do we have as individuals? We're hit with these persuasive messages constantly. The news, social media, advertising, even just our own friends and family. It's a lot.
Oh, it definitely is a challenge, but I don't think it's hopeless. And this is where Van Dyke's idea of discourse analysis comes in. He gives us this sort of manipulation checklist, things we can look for and how language is being used so we can spot those warning signs and protect ourselves.
Okay, yes. Give me the tools to fight back against this.
All right, well, first, always pay attention to imbalance. People who are trying to manipulate, they often present themselves in this really positive light, right? The heroes of the story. And then on the flip side, they portray their opponents or the people they want to control in a negative light, exaggerating their flaws, sometimes even straight up lying about them. This black and white thinking that us versus them kind of narrative, it's a classic red flag.
Ah, so that whole you're either with us or against us mentality. Definitely seen that before. Makes you feel like you have to choose a side, even when it's way more complicated than that. What else should we be on the lookout for?
Watch out for how information is being framed. Be wary of language that's really emphasizing the manipulator's authority, their supposed expertise, or your lack of knowledge. Phrases like, trust me, I know what's best, or that classic, you wouldn't understand, it's complicated. Anything to shut down critical thinking and discourage you from questioning their motives.
It's like when your parents used to say, because I said so. End of discussion.
Exactly. And then finally, and I think this is the most important one, pay close attention to emotional appeals. People who manipulate others are really good at using strong emotions, fear, anger, patriotism, even guilt, to kind of bypass that logical part of our brains and make us more susceptible to their message.
Okay, so if it feels like someone's trying to push your buttons to make you feel a certain way rather than actually engaging in a rational discussion, that's a major red flag.
Absolutely. Now, I know we've covered a lot here, so I think it would be helpful to ground this with a real-world example. Remember Tony Blair's speech to the UK Parliament back in 2003, where he was trying to justify going to war with Iraq?
Oh, yeah. That was a big one. Really controversial even back then. I mean, there were huge protests in the UK leading up to the invasion. People felt like Blair hadn't really made the case for going to war.
And that's why it's such a good example for us to look at. Blair's speech, it was masterful in terms of the rhetoric he used, but it also shows just how powerful manipulative language can be, even in a place like Parliament, where you'd think people would be, more savvy to that kind of thing.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. So let's break down some of the key parts of Blair's speech and see if we can spot any of these manipulative tactics in action. What did he say to try and win over Parliament and, by default, the British public?
Well, right off the bat, Blair tells Parliament that they have a democratic right to decide whether or not to go to war. He even says, it is the democracy which is our right, but for which others struggle in vain. Pretty powerful statement to make in that setting. Oh, absolutely. He's basically framing this whole decision as a matter of upholding their democratic values,
Hmm.
subtly implying, of course, that going against the war would be, undemocratic. Even though, like we were saying before, the actual decision to go to war seemed like it had already been made behind the scenes.
Yeah.
It's that false choice thing again, giving the illusion of a democratic process while actually steering them towards the outcome he wants.
Yeah, like he's saying, you can decide, but only if you decide what I want. Pretty manipulative. But it's not just about appealing to their sense of duty, right? Blair also goes for that emotional appeal, doesn't he?
Oh, big time. He keeps emphasizing his passionate belief that this war is necessary, framing it as this, like, moral imperative, not just a strategic decision. And that really plays into their sense of patriotism, that national identity thing. It creates that us versus them dynamic where anyone who's not fully on board with the war effort is basically siding with Saddam Hussein.
And that's a serious accusation to make, especially right after 9/11 when everyone was still so worried about terrorism.
Exactly. Blair taps into that fear directly, talking about the threat of weapons of mass destruction, saying things like that threat is real. He even uses this really strong language when he talks about Hussein's regime, calling it brutalized, saying it's a threat to our world. He's painting this very clear picture, good versus evil, and obviously he and the UK are on the side of good.
Classic tactic. Simplify the narrative, make the enemy seem purely evil, and then present yourself as the only solution. But what's really getting me is this wasn't just some speech to a random crowd. These were members of parliament, experienced politicians. You'd think they'd be able to see through this kind of manipulation.
And that's the thing about manipulation. It can be incredibly effective, even on people who think they're too smart to fall for it. Like we talked about before, Van Dyke makes it very clear that power dynamics play a huge role. In this situation, you've got the pressure to side with the prime minister, plus the fear of seeming like you're weak on national security.
Hmm.
I mean, you can imagine how those factors might push some people to vote for the war, even if they had doubts deep down.
Wow. Okay, that's
Yeah.
a scary thought. Makes you wonder if even people in those positions can be manipulated. What about the rest of us? We're dealing with this constant flood of information, persuasive messages coming at us from everywhere. It's overwhelming.
It's a challenge, for sure. And that's why understanding Van Dyke's work is so important. Once we start to recognize those tactics, those little signs that someone might be trying to manipulate us, we can start to see them more clearly and protect ourselves.
So it's all about being more aware, right? Being more critical of the information we're taking in and thinking about the motivations of the people who are giving us that information. We can't just passively accept everything we see and hear.
Exactly. Question everything. Look for different perspectives, especially in situations where it's clear one person or group has a lot more power than the other. Don't be afraid to challenge the narrative, even if it's coming from someone who seems like an authority. In fact, especially in those cases.
Okay, I love that. Such a good note to end on. We can't live in a bubble and completely avoid being manipulated, but we can definitely arm ourselves with knowledge and awareness. Understanding how language can be used to influence us, even in these really subtle ways, is a huge step towards making better choices and, just navigating the world with our eyes wide open.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, recognizing that manipulation is happening is the first and maybe the most important step towards defending yourself against it.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.